Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. Dr. Andrew Miki is a registered psychologist in British Columbia, Canada, with expertise in neuropsychology and cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. His private practice focuses on helping employees return to work following a disability leave due to stress, anxiety, burnout and depression. Andrew's vision is to democratise mental health care for people to live happier and healthier lives. In 2013, Andrew founded Starling Minds, a digital mental health company that created one of the first fully digital internet-based CBT programs for employees. Today, over 4.5 million people have free access to the personalised mental health program with proven results that were published in leading scientific journals and featured in Forbes and Authority magazine. Andrew now works with organisations and their leaders to improve their emotional intelligence, or EQ, with frameworks based on the latest science of clinical psychology. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Queen's University, an MA in Animal Cognition and Neuroscience from Wilfrid Laurier, and an MA PhD in Clinical Psychology from York University in Toronto. You can find Andrew at andrewmiki.com. Andrew, what I see in you is someone who's passionate about helping people to live healthier, happier, and more fulfilling lives. I sense that as a society, we generally understand good physical health, but struggle to understand and experience good mental health. And you've devoted your life to defining and helping solve this issue. If this resonates with you, welcome, and please tell us, how did you come to be in this place?
Thanks, Brad. I'm really excited to be here, so thank you for inviting me. So I got to this place by realizing that one of the things in life is that we can't necessarily choose the things that we're passionate about, and we can't always choose the things that we're the most interested in. One of the things that I found is that, so last night I took my daughter to a Pearl Jam concert. So she's 14, and I've been a lifelong Pearl Jam fan, and so it was a really cool experience where, I got to take her and my wife, and we're watching this band, and they've just been so big in my life, and I've listened to the music for so long. And when I was young, I really wished that I could have been like a rock star or a professional athlete. That's what I really wanted to do in life, in a way. But I think that certain limitations, just in terms of my musical gifts and my athletic gifts, were just not up to par at that level. So I had to realize that it wasn't in the cards for me. One of the things that I was very fortunate to kind of experience when I was younger was the introduction of psychology in my life. And I found that I became very passionate about the overall area. So whether it's social psychology, developmental, organizational, learning, sports psychology, clinical psychology, they're all different areas of psychology that I really can't get enough of, in a way. And so one of my life goals was to become a clinical psychologist. And that was a long road in and of itself. And that's why, I had the master's in animal cognition and neuroscience. My career took a bit of a detour, and I was, studying rats and pigeons and their ability to count and time stimuli. And eventually I got into a clinical program, and that was one of the best days of my life. That was one of the days when you finally get, that ticket where it's like, okay, now you're part of this program, and you're going to learn about all these things that I've always wanted to learn about. And it was an amazing experience because I really wanted to be one of the best clinicians I could be. And what I mean by that is somebody who could assess people really well and then treat people really well. And my dad, when I was growing up, was a GP, so he was a family doctor. So I grew up, in a healthcare type system. And in Canada, we have universal healthcare. And so it's one of those things that was always near and dear to my heart, one, to help people, but then also to try to help people in a way where they don't have to pay for it out of pocket themselves.
Yeah.
And so that really led to the whole vision that I have in terms of trying to democratize mental health care for people, because I do believe it's just part of the overall healthcare system, and it's people's right to have access to these things. And I think that throughout a lot of countries like Canada, Australia, the US, and the UK, a lot of mental health services are private, right? And so what that means is that a lot of people have to pay for it out of pocket, and it's not covered by the general healthcare system. And so in private practice, one of the things that I found is that working with people, like working with workers, employees who are on a disability leave, means that there's another angle to it where people are going to pay for it. Either unions are going to pay to get their members back, or the insurance is going to pay to get a worker back, things like that. So I found that it was a great area to get into, because I really like the idea of it having a clear goal. What are you trying to do with these people? You're trying to get them back to work, right? I think one of the challenges in clinical psychology is that sometimes we try to fix everything, right? There's so many things that you could address, but in a finite amount of time, what are you actually trying to do, right? And so I like that really clear goal. And I think, like a lot of people who do the same thing over and over again, right, eventually you start to see patterns in people and the way that they respond to treatment and the types of information that they need, and the things that they go through themselves in order to get over, or I guess overcome, their mental health issues, become stronger, more healthier at the end of it, and transition back to work, right? There's kind of a pattern in all of that. And that's what I really twigged onto in terms of starting with my private practice and then pitching to, in British Columbia, we've got a teachers union that's about 40,000 teachers. So it's a fairly large union. And I was treating a lot of their people at the time, and I pitched them this idea of doing groups, because I thought, well, rather than doing one at a time, how about if I do 5 to 8 at a time? Yeah. And so they liked the idea. We ran it for a couple of years and had great results. People, their symptoms were getting better. They were getting back to work. But more than anything, the thing that really got me about what I love about psychology and helping people is when people feel like they are empowered to manage their own mental health, when they have enough understanding, enough education, enough skills to manage it on their own. And that was a comment that a lot of people were saying. And so the Teachers Federation proposed that I roll out the program across the province to all of their members. And it was also at the time when I was thinking, you know what, I'm watching a lot of media on artificial intelligence. And at the time, it was like Deep Blue and all these programs were beating chess players, right? And I thought, well, would it be possible to build a program that would resemble what we do in psychology to help people go through the process and help them come out the other side? So that's what I embarked on. So that was the company that I worked in, that I founded and worked in until December of just last year. And then I moved on from there. And then that's when I it was a bit of an inflection point for me in terms of myself and my career. And I've really kind of moved into this area of emotional intelligence and using the frameworks that I've used in my clinical practice to scale that from individuals to groups to online automated programs, and seeing people get better to then transitioning to leaders. Because I think that that's a big way that you can influence a large number of people if you can really help the organization and the people who are leading it.
Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating story, and just wonderful to be, I guess, helping so many people through there. So what's the importance, or why is it important to understand the difference between our physical health system and our mental health system? And a leading or a subsequent question, what is mental fitness?
Okay, well, I think it's important to understand these two systems, because I don't believe you can have a happy and healthy life without having both, right? You need both physical health and mental health in order to, try to maximize the life that you've got. And so you really need both at the end of the day. And I think that what we don't always appreciate when it comes to physical health is like how far we've come since the mid-1900s in terms of our understanding of physical health, right? Because that was an evolution unto itself and a discovery in a way unto itself, right? Because until the mid-1900s, people didn't really have it top of mind that we should exercise in any way. right? And it was only, through observations, where people were becoming more sedentary with their work, and through observations of, it was actually in the UK where they studied bus drivers versus
I know
conductors.
that study.
You know that one? Yeah,
I've seen it with the heart attacks.
that's right. Right. And so that really put physical fitness on the map, right? Because if you're a driver of a bus and you're sitting all day long, they had a much greater likelihood of having heart attacks versus the conductors that were going up and down the rows and up and down, the double-decker bus, up and down the stairs, punching tickets, right? So those people had less of an incidence of cardiovascular disease. And so that was kind of the birth around that time of our understanding that, well, people need to exercise. And then, that's what's really kind of given way to all the fitness, the boom in physical fitness, especially over the last 30, 40 years. And so I think that we forget how we understand physical fitness now. It's kind of a use it or lose it mentality. And it's not just you need to walk a lot. It's broken down in terms of, there's strength training, there's cardio, there's stretching, there's all these different areas that you need to kind of focus on, and you should focus on all three really, and not just one at the exclusion of others, right? So we understand that when it comes to physical health. When it comes to mental health, I think that there's some overlap in terms of we know that if you sleep well and if you eat well, it helps both your physical and mental health. Like, that's kind of a given. But when it comes to specific mental health skills, I think that we're really, as a society, we're really at a loss in terms of, unlike physical, what are you supposed to do, right? And there's lots of different people weighing in with lots of different ideas, from, meditation to gratitude to, drinking more water. And these are all good things, but specifically, what skill sets do they address, right? And so mental fitness, what it is just the idea that, like physical fitness, if we exercise, right, we can help our brains become stronger and more resilient over time. And so that's really the idea, behind the idea of mental fitness.
Which is about, I guess, resilience in one part, but how to, specifically, our audience is typically entrepreneurs and leaders. So how do entrepreneurs and leaders jeopardize their mental fitness? How do they put it at risk? Or burnout is something that we've all heard of. I've lived my life with entrepreneurs and leaders, and it can be a challenging situation, and they're supposed to look tough, but how does mental fitness play into all of that? How do they jeopardize that?
How do they jeopardize it? I would say that there's a couple of ways. One is kind of a general way, because entrepreneurs, CEOs, leaders, they're people like everybody else, right? Yeah. And so then, on one hand, as people, in our society, there's so much stigma associated with mental illness, right? And so then, one of the ways that all people jeopardize their mental fitness and their mental health is by not really knowing that much about it, right? Not, fearing it, right? Which is understandable, because I think throughout, the ages, people have always feared mental illness and not understood it, right? And so there's always been a level of fear and anxiety around it. And as to your point, as a leader, people look to you to be strong. And if you show any vulnerability or weakness, a lot of times that can be used against you, right? Or it typically has in the past. And so I think that as a result, then, society in and of itself has kind of encouraged people to kind of, take that kind of stiff upper lip approach and just kind of barrel through a lot of things, right? And so that's the way that a lot of people end up experiencing burnout or, a lot of mental health issues. And specifically for entrepreneurs and CEOs and executives, one of the things that they have in common is there's aspects of their personality profile that they have in common, right? And so two aspects. So one of the dominant theories in personality psychology is this 5-factor model, or the NEO. It breaks personality down to extroversion, how extroverted versus introverted you are, how agreeable you are, how open-minded you are, how emotionally stable you are, and how conscientious you are, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things about entrepreneurs and CEOs and executives is that they're all very, very conscientious people. right? They're all hardworking, they're driven, they're generally good at setting a goal and working towards that goal. They're very dutiful, right? They feel an obligation
Yeah.
to, keep working even sometimes when they shouldn't. So they've got that aspect. And then emotional stability is also another important personality factor, where generally, if somebody wants to become a CEO or an entrepreneur or an executive, you'd really want the conscientiousness to be high, and you'd want the emotional stability side to be high as well, right? Because as you know, right, when you're in the world of business, there's a lot of things that are coming at you, a lot of different challenges all the time. And as you know, especially when you're the leader, if you're an entrepreneur or you're a founder, if you're a CEO, there's so many things that are flying at you, so many different stressors that are coming at you, that you have to be able to take it, weather it, figure out what you're going to do, and then direct everybody in terms of work with everybody in terms of what you ultimately want to try to achieve. And one of the things that a lot of entrepreneurs and executives don't realize is that sometimes they are doing things that are contributing to them slightly going downhill, right? Day after day. And they don't see it and they don't recognize it. And a lot of times, because of their personality makeup, they feel like, well, let's just knuckle down and work through this. Because that's what's worked for them in the past, and that's what's given them a lot of success, right?
Yeah.
But the challenge is that if they can't pretty much like outlast those stressors, if they can't, essentially is what it is, then they just keep going further and further down.
So it keeps working until it doesn't.
That's right. And then their internal conscientiousness drives them further and further downwards, right?
Yeah.
And then so that in combination with the other factors like the stigma, the not wanting to admit that you're struggling in any way, right? It just prolongs them from seeking help or talking about it and making changes in their life to ultimately change the trajectory of where it's going.
But the problem that I have experienced and observed is that they need to maintain a facade, an external appearance that everything is still good and that we're still on the trajectory of growth that we aim for. It's still a great place to work. You've got to maintain everything that's going on, but on the inside, you're getting eaten up.
That's true. And that's what's so difficult for a lot of people, right? Because a lot of times, in CEO groups, they talk about, what keeps you up at night? What are all those things that are going on in the background that just, that kind of hamster wheel, kind of mentality, what's going on and how do you resolve that, right? And so I think that without any education or specific skills in all of those areas, people are just left to their own devices, right? And then hopefully things work until they don't. And, and if somebody crashes or really experiences a significant, kind of burnout, experience, and they can't work anymore, then it forces it to the forefront. And then people are, they're forced to actually do something about it.
Yeah, yeah. We came across a tool from a good friend of mine, Kevin Lawrence, who wrote a book called Your Oxygen Mask First. Yeah. Which is about looking after yourself, partially from a mental health context, and the people who report to you. And one of the tools that he also introduced me to was the mental health continuum, which I think was actually from the Canadian Mental Health Association. I could have got that slightly wrong. And that is a spectrum from, let's say, green to red, with orange and yellow in the middle. That talks about what are the symptoms that you're experiencing and what are the actions that you can use within that sense. So tell us about your framework. So we've just addressed how do leaders jeopardize their own mental fitness. Tell us about the framework that you've developed for entrepreneurs and leaders to improve their emotional fitness.
Okay, well, the framework it includes aspects like the mental health continuum, like you talked about, and people like Kevin are great in the sense that they're championing this idea, right? This idea that mental health is on a continuum; it's not black and white, where you're either crazy or normal or healthy or unhealthy. It's on a continuum. And I think it helps advance our understanding of mental health, because I think that it's very archaic to look at it in terms of crazy and normal, right? Because people have a general sense as to what crazy is, but nobody can really define what normal is. And so then it's just unfair to have that as potential way of looking at it, right?
Yeah.
And I think when you look at physical health, you really want to look at it on a continuum as well, in terms of healthy all the way to unhealthy. And the unhealthy is not just unhealthy. There's mild, moderate, and severe, right? And
Yeah, of course.
And so the framework that I've developed has been it's basically it's been born out of what leading clinical psychology approaches take in order to get patients well and get them from the unhealthy range to the healthy range and to keep them there. So essentially what it is this idea of, well, if you picture it like a triangle, the most basic skill when it comes to mental health, mental fitness, is self-awareness, right? People need to be self-aware of themselves. And what that means is it's a broad umbrella term, right? And it needs to be kind of conceptualized and it needs to be defined to a certain degree, right? Because otherwise it could just be way too broad. And the way that I like to look at self-awareness is the internal self-awareness. So how well do you know your own personality? How well do you know your own values? How well do you know your own patterns in like situational awareness, right? In different situations, you're going to have different things happening, and how can you know those patterns? And then part of it as well is just understanding, being self-aware of your own mental health, right? So your own mental health right now, and also what it's been like over the course of your life. I've worked with a lot of people who had no idea that they've experienced so much anxiety or negativity throughout their lives until it really comes crashing down, many years later. So all of that is so important. And the reason why it's at the bottom of that kind of pyramid is because, to me, self-awareness, it's sort of like if you want to, in Canada, we're hockey fanatics right now because it's the playoffs, right? And Vancouver is now doing very well. So we're all very happy here. But it's sort of like if you want to play hockey, you need to know how to skate, right? Or if you want to play tennis or golf, you need to hit the ball, right? Or if you want to read, you have to know the alphabet. It's the most basic, the most fundamental understanding. So you have to have self-awareness for yourself and self-awareness of how you interact with other people. So once you have that, then there's specific skills to help, specific exercises to help train people along those skills of self-awareness. Okay. And then the rung above it would be emotional regulation, right? People need to be able to understand different emotions that they experience and, have a easy framework to understand, what does it look like when you're doing well? Like often it's referred to being in the zone, right? And what does it look like when you're outside of that? And when you're outside of that, how do you know you're outside and what do you do to bring yourself back in, right? So if somebody has really poor emotional regulation, if they're a leader, they're probably having temper tantrums, right? Much like, a toddler in a way, right? Yeah. And so that would be poor emotional regulation. So that is an important skill set, right? And then in addition to that, thought management is an important skill set as well, right? Because a lot of times people are really fond of mindfulness, right? Because mindfulness really helps people become more self-aware, and in doing it, sometimes it can help regulate people, right? It can help them regulate their emotions. So it can do a few different things, but it doesn't necessarily always give clarity in terms of what you're going to do about a situation or how you're going to think about an issue, right? And so there's a framework for that also from cognitive behavior therapy that helps people address that, right? And so when you have those three areas, in addition to, ability to organize and plan and set goals, those are big parts of cognitive behavior therapy that really help people change the trajectory of where their symptoms are going. Right. But they're also good skills that everybody should learn. I mean, my kids are 14 and 11, and I want them to learn some of these skills, even though they're well right now. Yeah. Right. And then when people get really good at these skills, especially when they're unwell, then what I also notice is that more advanced skills like decision making and assertiveness and self-confidence also improve. Right. And so these are, this is at the pinnacle of the skills that you want people to really focus on as well when they're healthy. Right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I want people to be self-confident because I want them to have a strong belief in their abilities to manage challenges, but also I want them to maintain, a sense that they've got control and a generally positive view of themselves, no matter what's going on, right? And I find that self-confidence is a real protective piece against mental health issues, mental illness like anxiety and depression, and also it leads to a much better quality of life.
Of course.
Right.
Of course. What I love about that is that if you imagine an organisational chart as a pyramid,
Yep.
at the bottom of the pyramid, assuming that's more frontline workers, most of the person's day-to-day is technical skills. It's
Right.
utilising technical skills to get the job done. And then as you move to supervisor and manager and senior management and then leadership or CEO, it's more about the personality and their ability to utilise that emotional intelligence. And then coupling that with... I could be wrong here, but I think I'm confident enough to say people find it hard to improve their IQ. However, you can improve your EQ. And that's what you're really saying there is improving your emotional quotient.
That's really what it is at the end of the day. I studied EQ a little bit when I was in grad school. I remember going to the American Psychological Association conference in Toronto. So this is when, I'm a grad student, right? So I'm totally geeking out on all things psychology. I just got into clinical psych. It was a huge event, and it was in Toronto. And unfortunately, that was the year that SARS hit. And so a lot of people didn't come, but a few people did. And a couple of really key psychologists, Martin Seligman is one, and he's been kind of an idol to me because we were both in animal cognition and then he moved into clinical. And some of his ideas about how people learn to become depressed, he coined it learned hopelessness, came from animal models, which I found really interesting. And then there was another group, I can't remember his first name, I know his last name was Salve, and they developed an emotional intelligence test. Right. So they were trying to, quantify it. They're trying to, figure out what are the different aspects of emotional intelligence and how do we actually have an objective test for it. So that really turned me on to the whole idea of emotional intelligence and how important it is, because I believe that people are generally intelligent people, right? Not always IQ wise, but they can be really skilled and really gifted in other areas. Right. And I think what happened in psychology was that psychologists defined intelligence, and then we created intelligence tests for it. And then in the 80s, one psychologist identified there being so many different multiple intelligences, right? So somebody could have athletic intelligence or music intelligence over and above the traditional IQ. And then that's when Daniel Goleman in the 90s really kind of put it all together and identified what emotional intelligence is. And I think a lot of people bind to it because it makes a lot of sense. And to your point, that's what is so valuable the higher up in the hierarchy you go in an organization. But it's so elusive in the sense of how do you actually train people? And I think that's been a question for many years. How do you actually train the skill sets? Because there's certain components of emotional intelligence, self-awareness being one of them. But how do you actually train somebody to be self-aware? And that, I think, has been a missing piece that I'm trying to, bring to the table in terms of, there's been a lot of advancement in clinical psychology that we use to train patients how to do this. And so then as a result, if you know this when you're well, it can serve as a big protective mechanism. Sort of like if you're reasonably healthy and you exercise and you do those three different things, you stretch, you do some cardio, and you do some weight training, that will prevent you from having, it will reduce the likelihood that you're going to experience physical health issues and mental health issues as well.
If you think about the memes or the complaints from people about management or leadership, it most of the time comes down to low EQ decisions. Most of the time, they're criticising things that necessarily don't make sense from their perspective. That may not have considered all of the kind of either the facts of the matter or the things that are going on. So how does a low emotional intelligence negatively impact leaders?
Oh, in so many ways. I think that the biggest issue that a lot of leaders might have is holes in their self-awareness in the different areas that I was kind of mentioning, right? So if a leader has a low level of self-awareness in terms of their personality or the way that they react to certain situations, right? Or even how they're doing in terms of their mental health or how they're interacting with other people, right? These can have really significant impacts on the organization, right? And so if you can imagine, a leader, say a CEO, who has low self-awareness around how they interact with other people. So they think that they're always nailing it, right? They think that every interaction, they're thinking, oh yeah, everybody's walking away with, the fact that I nailed it, and everybody else in the room is thinking, what is he talking about?
It's so common,
right?
Yeah.
And if you think about like micromanagers, right? Who is a micromanager? Nobody puts up their hand. But if you say who hates working for a micromanager, everybody puts up their hand.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that sometimes, amongst the micromanagers, there could be low self-awareness that you are actually a micromanager, even though in your own perception you're not. Right. So when people have low self-awareness in combination with, say, low empathy, right, to your point, if the leaders are making these decisions, they can't see it from other workers' points of view in terms of why they're going to question this decision, right? Then you could see how there's going to be a disconnect, right, in terms of the messaging, and then an overall lack of clarity, which is the biggest issue that teams face, right? When there's a lack of clarity and a lack of alignment, within the leadership team, that's one of the biggest threats to, how well a company can be run efficiently, right? So that's why organizations that focus so much on the culture, that's why it's so important that you have those areas really tight.
But you can focus on your culture, and you can read all of the culture books, and you can do all of the things, but I've seen it where we're trying to do that with leaders, but the low self-awareness or the low emotional quotient of the CEO is meaning that it's not working the way it's supposed to work in the books. That's so right. Funny. Yeah.
Well, because that's the way that, everything works, right? Like the way that we write the books or the frameworks or all the rest of it, it's all frameworks, right? Like cognitive behavior therapy is a framework for therapy for depression or anxiety. And it works really well because of the kind of science that's gone into it, the skills, the exercises that you try to help people with. But sometimes many times it doesn't go according to plan, right? For a lot of different reasons. And it's the same way that you're talking about in terms of a CEO. Like, if we have all these things, we're doing everything by the book, why is it not working, right? And then that's where the real kind of art and science really come into it, right? In terms of really how to, try to help get it on track.
And so let's switch gears. How can entrepreneurs and leaders improve their resilience?
That's a good question. So I think that there's a couple of ways. I mean, there's two aspects in my mind that help improve resilience. One is, do you have the skills in order to actually take on adversity? Right? Because I think the way that a lot of people look at resilience is that they want it to grow linearly over time, right? It needs to be a straight, if you imagine like a graph, it's like a 45-degree angle up, right? That's what everybody wants, right? That's what they think success is. And resilience is a skill like everything else. And when you learn a new skill, it's messy, right? It's up and down, and it's not a straight line. And it's so ironic because if it was a straight line, you wouldn't actually learn to be more resilient because everything's going smoothly, right? A big part of resilience is knowing it's like, okay, when you hit when you're going upwards and something happens that causes you to go down, right? Do you have the skills to know, like, do you have the self-awareness to know that you're going down and the reason why? And then do you have all the other skills, like the emotional regulation skills, the thought management skills, the planning, the organization, the decision-making skills, right? To then manage the upsetness that you've had or the challenges you have in that situation, and then get it back on track and then keep it going, right? And all things being equal, if you get triggered by the same thing. So one example I can think of is when I started the company, this was back in 2013, there weren't very many players in the space when I started. There was maybe a dozen at the most. And every time I saw a new one, right, I'd see their website, fancy website, and I'd be triggered and I'd have the same reaction. I'd think, oh man, this one looks even better than the last, and this one's doing all these things, and it's doing it better than us, and all everybody's going to go to them and not to us. And over time, I had to kind of realize, well, that was my reaction and it wasn't actually the reality, right? I mean, lots of companies were coming up and I had to look at it for what it was. It helped validate the space. It helped, to prove that there was something in this area. And then I also had to manage myself with it. So resilience over time is do you know the skills? can you apply those skills in the real world setting? And every time you get triggered by that, can you shrink that time, that kind of lull that you go through? So can you shrink the amount of time that you're in it? Can you shrink how deep you go in it? And can you shrink the amount of time it takes you to get things back on track? And the faster you can do that against all the different types of adversity that you face, then that's improving your resilience over time, right? And so you need to hit those downswings. You need to hit that adversity in order to learn how to come out of it more effectively and more efficiently.
And so when you say at the beginning there, do you have the skills? What you mean is the skills to understand what is occurring in your mind. Like, I am feeling this, I'm thinking this because of whatever it might be.
That's right, right? Because a lot of times I think that we assume that we're aware of everything that we're thinking about all the time. Yeah. And we're not, right? A lot of times we're on automatic pilot, which is it's a common concept in cognitive behavior therapy. And if you just imagine driving to work every day, if people are still doing that, right, then a lot of times you're on automatic pilot and you might be just in your own thoughts, and then all of a sudden you might need to stop abruptly, or all of a sudden you tune into the song that you've been listening to for a while and you're like, I can't stand this song, right? Yeah. And then you kind of get jarred out of it, and then you start noticing what's going on around you. Yeah. Right. And I see that all the time, right? Whether it's in companies or, people in their personal lives, where they can go through the day and not know that something earlier on really upset them. And then they get home and then they might be really irritable with their family or something like that. And they're not really tying the two together.
Yeah. Yeah. And picking up on a couple of points that you've mentioned there, anxiety and depression, how can people actually learn to become anxious or depressed over time?
I think that's a really good question, because I think that a lot of times when people look at anxiety or depression, they often say, well, there's a nature-nurture aspect to it, right? So the nature aspect is, well, your genetics, and it's like, okay, well, we can't control that, right? If you've got a lot of family members with a lot of mental health issues, your genetic loading is going to be higher. Right? It doesn't mean that you're going to experience it, but it just means that you're more vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, there's that environment side, right? And well, I think people have identified adverse situations like, say, divorce, right, or getting fired, or financial strain, or things like that. These things can bring out a lot of stress. But I think that one of the things that has really stood out to me over the years, especially after doing my master's in learning, really, essentially, it was animal cognition and neuroscience, was where we studied how pigeons and rats learn how to count and time stimuli. So it taught me, it's like, well, they just don't wake up and learn how to do that. You have to train them to do that day after day for many days, many weeks, and then they can acquire the skill, right? And it's the same thing in terms of people do things that can lead to more depression and anxiety over time, right? So one example might be when people are experiencing more social anxiety, right? Yeah. What does that mean? It means that people are more self-conscious in social situations, right? There's a lot of uncertainty in social situations, right? Like right now, we're staring at each other and you're nodding, you're smiling. I have no idea what you're thinking. Right? And I think you're following along and I think we're on the same page, but I actually have no idea what's actually going on. And so because of that uncertainty, what it does is it can breed a lot of worry in people, because that's how worry comes about. We worry about things that are uncertain, right? Yeah. And so if we worry about how we're going to conduct ourselves, or who's going to be there, how things are going to go, am I going to do or say something wrong or embarrassing, right? All these different things, then if you imagine that, let's say we're attending a party, on Thursday night or something like that, and the closer it gets to Thursday, the more my anxiety is going to grow, right? And one of the most effective ways to get rid of the anxiety in the moment is to avoid going. Because the minute you say to yourself, I'm not going to go, then all of a sudden that social anxiety just dissipates, right? You don't have to face all of these people and the challenging situations and the rest of it. And so even though it's effective in the moment, it can actually backfire if that becomes a chronic pattern of behavior, right? Over and over and over again. So I start to avoid more and more social situations. What that does is it makes your anxiety grow over time, right? And so it makes it that much more difficult to face that social situation. right? So there's lots of things that people do. So it's not like people just wake up one day and they're socially anxious that they can't go to the party anymore.
They learn that. Yeah.
Over a long time
Yeah.
of not going, of avoiding a lot of social situations.
We had dinner with a group a few weeks ago, and we spoke about self-confidence being at the core, maybe at the core, but I'm going to misrepresent this, but you're going to catch me as I fall. Being at the core, and that what leads to anxiety is lower self-confidence, perhaps. And then there's a connection with depression. And so what can you tell us about the connection between anxiety and self-confidence?
Okay, so one thing that I can state is that I have treated, hundreds of patients over the years, and with Starling, we treated thousands of people over the years. I have never seen somebody present with clinical anxiety or depression and also have general high self-confidence at the same time. The two cannot exist in combination.
Yeah.
Right? The reason for it is because when people become clinically anxious over time, one of the common patterns that ends up happening is that people overestimate the amount of danger that they're in, and they underestimate their ability to cope. Right? So essentially what that means is that day over day, week over week, year after year, this happens over a long period of time. The way that people interact with the world is that they see more and more threat, or the possibility of threat. And then they doubt whether or not they can handle that threat. Well, imagine going through life like that every day, where all you're seeing are threats and you don't trust yourself to be able to manage it or handle it, right? So you can see how that's eroding somebody's confidence, right? For them to be able to, to think, well, I don't know what I don't know, but I got to go into the situation. I'll deal with it as it comes up, right? I'll do my best, right? So
And
that's...
so is that how in times past, you would have people who would get audio tapes, and they would tell people, I would say the old school thought leaders, get up in the morning, look in the mirror and tell yourself, I'm going to succeed today. I'm going to make this deal, whatever it is. It sounds like if I get what you just said about learning how to become anxious and depressed, or learning the behaviors, number one, and then that self-confidence is not connected to these things. It sounds like what they were doing then is training people self-confidence.
They're trying to. I mean, it's one thing it's kind of like a pre-game routine, right? If you can say those things and you believe those things, if it works for you, if that's a technique that works for you and it makes you feel more confident going into the world, then that would be a thing, right? That you could do, right? I mean, personally, I can't buy into something like that. It doesn't really work for me, right? And so I got to find other ways to improve, and maintain my self-confidence. But knowing that self-confidence is the outcome of many, many things that have happened over a long period of time, right? Or it gets eroded, right, over a long period of time, conversely, right, is really important. Because if you think about depression, right, what happens when people are depressed, right? They end up being really negative, right, towards the world, towards themselves, towards other people, and they look through things through that really negative lens, but they end up talking to themselves in a really terrible way, right? I mean, they say, they essentially bully themselves, right? And they talk to themselves in a way that they would never talk to anybody else generally, right? And so if you think about just berating yourself and bullying yourself and what that feels like to yourself, right? You're beating yourself down, and then you're starting to feel as if whatever you do, it doesn't make a difference, right? You start to feel like that loss of control, that loss of hope, right? In terms of you can actually have an effect or have an effective outcome in something. And even if you do, because of the way that you've been seeing things, the way you've been learning it, you don't see it necessarily for what it is, right? And then when that kind of takes over, you could see how then if somebody is that negative towards themselves, well, you're attacking your self-confidence every day over and over and over again. So that's essentially how people can learn, over a long period of time, things that they can do every day that just contribute to more anxiety or more depression.
Yeah. You're an entrepreneur. You're a doer. Tell me, You've got your own practice, and you probably deal with a lot of entrepreneurs as well. In your experience, what does a better business look like for you?
I think a better business for me looks like a few things. I think at the end of the day, it has to have a framework and it has to have some process behind it at several levels, right? So that's one of the things that I learned, being in clinical psychology and then moving over to, becoming an entrepreneur. I had no idea until I started the company how important process was in everything, right? You're supposed to have process in everything, right? Process in hiring, your process in onboarding people, right? There's a process behind that, behind sales, behind R&D that we did, because we did a lot of R&D in terms of trying to create an automated program to help people with their mental health, right? So there was a process behind all of those different things, and I think that companies that have a framework, whether it's like the one-page plan or metronomics or whatever it may be, you need to have something like that aligns the entire company, right? So that everybody's very clear on what it is that you're trying to do, when you're trying to achieve it by, and how you're going to do it, right? I think that is really, really critical for an organization. In addition to that, I'm a big believer in people getting coached. I mean, it's partly because I'm a clinical psychologist, but it's also partly because in working as a CEO or as an executive, there's so many things I didn't know, right? And so I relied on other people to either help me acquire the skills or the knowledge, or also help me see the blind spots that I couldn't see for myself, right, in terms of my tendencies. So I think that having a team that has that general framework, that has a coach behind it. And then at the end of the day, I think all of this is working towards trying to win, right, as a business. And in order to win as a business, Shannon Susko often talks about, it's a team sport, right? And so it is, right? You have to have a team, and there's always some level of dysfunction within lots of different teams. Like even sports teams that win championships, there's still dysfunction amongst that. But organizations and teams win when it can overcome all of that dysfunction, and the culture within the organization is strong enough that everybody can come together and achieve the greater good, right? And I think that an organization that has those frameworks, that has that support, but also has that culture within not just the executive team, but throughout the entire company, where there is that kind of psychological safety where people can say what's on their mind, or they can challenge the authority, or they can challenge, whatever the direction is respectfully, right? And have a debate, have, some back and forth on it until, it's decided which way people are going to go. I think that having a company like that, is the ultimate, right? In terms of, what we're aspiring to.
I love it. It certainly speaks to my lived experience, that's for sure, over time. So is there a book that you would recommend for our audience?
Actually, one book, and one of the things that I've been referencing a lot, I've noticed today when I was talking, was how so much of mental health is the outcome of many things that have been going on in people's lives for a long period of time, right? And part of the reason why I've been saying it like that is because I've been reading Atomic Habits, I think it's a really interesting book in terms of having a framework for habits in general, like good habits and bad habits, and so much of mental health and people's ability to manage it is the result of good and bad habits, right? People have drinking issues, or people have anxiety or depression, largely because of bad habits that have been going on for a long period of time. And people think that, well, what do I do in order to get over it? I need to do this, or I need to do that. And it's not true most of the time. Most of the time when it comes to people overcoming mental illness, it's many things that are going on, right? It's sort of like self-awareness. There's many bricks of self-awareness that need to be laid down in a foundation, right? To then allow the next layer of, say, emotional regulation skills, and then thought management skills, and increased decisiveness, assertiveness, and confidence, right? So it's the outcome of a lot of those things. And so I really like the framework. Like it's similar to what I'm trying to say in a way where we can't do the work for people, right? But there's a way that people can look at it that where the work could be a lot easier, right? Like if you want to become more resilient or more mentally fit, there's a framework to do it. There's specific exercise and specific skills that you can learn that will make it easier rather than just, kind of a shotgun approach where you're just trying to take in everything.
Yeah, I love it. And it does connect to really what we were saying at the beginning, which is we know what physical fitness is. We know the elements of physical fitness and these habits that you're speaking about. There is a path that is becoming clearer to us all now around mental fitness. How can people learn more about you and your business?
Well, they can always email me. My email is andrew@mentalfitness.ca. They can also check out my website. I just published that a couple of weeks ago. So it's, early days in that one, but, all of the offerings that I have for leadership and, whether it's virtual or in person, all the information's up there in terms of the types of courses that I run and, the kind of different training methods that I use. It's all up there. So if anybody's interested, feel free to check that out.
Lovely. Thank you. Now, what haven't we covered off today that you hoped to cover off in the conversation?
I think what I want to stress then is how exciting a time it is right now when it comes to mental health. It's a really challenging time, I would say, because I've done a lot of work in corporate education and healthcare. And a lot of these sectors are really struggling with more burnout issues than ever before, right? And with as much adversity as what we're experiencing, there's a lot of opportunity, right? Because of the amount of issues mental illness is causing, it's pushed it to the forefront. And that's why we're talking about it. If it wasn't affecting as many people to the extent that it is, it'd still be in the background. The stigma would still be really high, and we'd sweep it under a rug, right? So the opportunity is that there's more and more knowledge and information coming out about it. But more than anything, what I hope people can appreciate is that there's a lot of things that people can do about it if we can overcome the stigma around it, if we can learn about it, and you can learn the appropriate skills and things that you need to learn in order to manage it for yourself. So I think that now it's to me, it's sort of like, the mid 1900s, right? Like, I think we are now just really understanding mental health and mental fitness, like the physical world back then. And so I think we're just on the cusp of this boom of how people can really understand mental fitness and start leveraging the specific skills that they need to kind of take care of it for themselves, because that's the ultimate. People are always going to be sick, right? And for lots of different reasons. But I think that the difference with mental health versus physical health is that in mental health, people often feel really helpless. Right? They don't know where to go. They don't know what kind of resources to access. They don't really know what to do. And I'm hoping that, we as a society is just starting to change that with, things that are more actionable, things that are more specific, things that are more effective, right? In terms of specific skills to help people, protect their mental health and keep it as well. And ultimately, we have one life to live, right? I mean, you want it to be the best one you can, right? And so if you can do everything you can to kind of pave the way for it to be as happy and healthy as possible, I think that, the information, the knowledge is now out there, unlike before.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I love the work that you're doing. I love the way that you're coming at it from multiple angles. And there's been some gems in our conversation today. So thank you from me and from our audience for your valuable time today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Brad.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.